I'm gonna just go ahead and paraphrase Madmen's Don Draper here and say the Sega Genesis Mini 2 isn't just a miniature all-in-one console, it's a time machine. It takes us to a place where we ache to go again. Don's whole pitch works perfectly for these retro consoles. While this miniature homage to Sega's beloved 16-bit system falls short of its predecessor and the TurboGrafx 16 Mini when it comes to the quality of the controller and its menus, it's still a wonderful little piece of technology that lets us go to a place where we know we're loved. The Genesis Mini 2 is the follow-up to the Genesis Mini I reviewed back in 2019. I was quite taken by Sega's first trip into the world of the mini console, and thus I was excited by the announcement of a second Genesis, this one based appropriately on the Sega Genesis Model 2, which was a smaller version of the console released in 1994. This one includes a 6-button Genesis controller, something missing from the original Mini. The good news is the proper expanded controller is right there, included in the box, and will work with your original Genesis Mini 2. The bad news, the controller kind of sucks. As far as first-party replicas of old controllers go, the one that comes with the Genesis Mini 2 is passable at best. The buttons feel pretty terrible. They have a mushiness I found really off-putting, and the D-pad shares the same tactile unpleasantness. I didn't notice any lack of responsiveness while playing, but it just feels light and cheap, almost like it was an afterthought. The 3-button controller that came with the original, but at least there were 2 of them in the box instead of just 1. The Genesis Mini 2's UI is mostly unchanged from the original. The menu screen music isn't nearly as good, but all the other options I liked have returned, like seeing your quote-unquote collection spines out, as well as a few new wallpapers for the menu screens and during gameplay. There's not much in the way of improvement from the first, and honestly, since I'm not too fond of the music, it makes it slightly less great. It's a shame that Sega didn't take some inspiration from the far superior UI delightfulness of the TurboGrafx 16 Mini. For example, while the Genesis Mini 2 does include a healthy selection of Sega CD games, it lacks the TurboGrafx 16 Mini's added touch, a custom region-specific animation when you loaded up a cart or CD-ROM game. In other words, if you loaded a CD from the US interface, it resembled the US version of the TurboGrafx, whereas loading from the Japanese interface resembled the PC Engine. While EU games look like the EU version of the PC Engine, it even simulated the sound of a CD drive spinning up and reading the disc. It was very cool and very pointless, but a loving touch that's completely missing from the Genesis Mini 2, and it's disappointing to me, a grown man who loves make-believe sounds. The emulation and UI was capably handled by M2, and if you're not familiar, M2 is basically a group of trickster gods. It's responsible for some of the best game preservation projects around and has set the high watermark in video game preservation and restoration. This team could have built a custom emulator and UI, copy-pasted in some ROM files, called it a day, but that's not how M2 operates, not even close. No, M2's developers not only went ahead and added a few unreleased games to the Genesis Mini 2, it ported some old arcade games to the Genesis, which is amazing. They didn't have to do that, but they did just as a flex. But there's more. Space Harrier 2, a Sega arcade classic, originally did get a Genesis port, but M2 said, yeah, but what if Genesis had support for sprite scaling? And they just went ahead and made that a thing, but also added the same sprite scaling support for the Genesis version of the original Space Harrier. So you get a bonus game, one that I personally love quite a bit. On top of creating ports where none existed before, M2 has made a few tweaks to its included games. Phantasy Star 2, one of the most legendary of the 16-bit RPGs of old, has quality of life improvements in a similar vein to what M2 did with the Sega Ages version of the original Master System version of Phantasy Star. Basically, it's been made more palatable to play in 2022 thanks to an easy mode and an increased walking speed. Trust me, you're going to want to enable it. The walking speed on those early Phantasy Star games is rough. Compared to the original, it's hard to say if the Genesis Mini 2 has a better selection of games or not. Honestly, I would put them at a dead heat and say the game selections are complementary to one another, even if they aren't all bangers. There's definitely a fair number of duds here. Bonanza Brothers, not a game I enjoyed at all. The Ninja Warriors feels like it was added because the license was inexpensive, and Virtua Racing for Sega Genesis is the least of all versions of that game. However, in the case of virtual racing, it makes sense from a historical perspective to add it to the Genesis Mini 2 because at the time, it was mind-blowing. But now it's just clunky and unfun. Night Trap is another one of those games that is just famously awful, but historically it might be the most significant game on the list. None of the other games on the Genesis Mini 2 can boast they invited the wrath of the legislative branch of the United States government. It would be a shame not to have it included, even if it is a pretty craptacular FMV game. The Sega Genesis Mini 2 is another great entry in the weird niche world of retro gaming all-in-ones, carefully curated and crafted by M2. Aside from the obvious refresh of games and a focus on the Sega CD, the overall Genesis Mini 2 experience isn't changed much from its predecessor, which feels like a bit of a missed opportunity, and the single included 6-button controller feels pretty flimsy. Still, this is easily the best way to play not so great but historically significant games like Sewer Shark and the debacle that is Night Trap. Thankfully, a larger proportion of the 61 games are bona fide all-time classics. There are even new additions by way of newly created ports and reimaginings of older games, as well as the welcome quality of life improvements in Phantasy Star 2, and this shows how much M2 cares about these old games. The Genesis Mini 2 isn't a copy-paste of some ROM folder, it's a custom experience that takes you back to an earlier time when it seemed like Sega might just be able to win the console wars of the early 1990s. It lets us travel the way a child travels, around and back home again. For even more retro console goodness, check out our review of the Sega Genesis Mini, and for everything else, keep it right here on IGN.
If you don't have the brains or the guts for this assignment, give the controls to someone who does.